All right, we've started streaming to the Baltimore City Delegation page, and we'll also make sure that we post this video on our newly launched YouTube channel, and that will give another opportunity for public engagement. So good evening, my name is Delegate Stephanie Smith. I represent the 45th District in the Maryland House of Delegates. I'm also chair of the House Delegation to the Maryland General Assembly. I'm excited. We started streaming to that Baltimore. I think we just got a little feedback from someone that may not be on mute. But at any rate, we're super excited to have an opportunity to discuss another facet of the actually issue that we're discussing nationally, which is around police accountability reform and those issues concerning public safety and community connection. I know that many people are aware across Maryland that Baltimore City is currently in the midst of its own federal consent decree process with the U.S. Department of Justice. But we're not the only jurisdiction in the state that has experienced that, nor the only city, obviously, in the country. So I wanted to give an opportunity, not just for Baltimore residents, but for Marylanders writ large, an opportunity to really understand what a consent decree really means, what it means in terms of its objectives, what it can mean for community members and their feelings of public safety and their relationship to law enforcement, and what it means for law enforcement, what it means for training, what it means for the experience of being a law enforcement professional before a consent decree, during a consent decree, and after a consent decree. I just want to ground this conversation in a couple of key facts for folks that may not be aware. We're 5 years out from the Baltimore uprising. In April of 2015, there were protests not only in Baltimore, but across the world, quite frankly, in the wake of the death of Freddie Gray. He was a young West Baltimorean who received injuries while in police custody that later ended with his life being lost. And that was not the only instance that aroused the concerns and the passions and the anger of Baltimore residents and those concerned about police accountability, but it was a tipping point in the conversation. So that's April of 2015. In May of 2015, then U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch announced that there would be an investigation into the Baltimore Police Department because there had been public requests from officials and the community to look into a pattern of practice that could be potentially deemed to be found unconstitutional in violation of various amendments, including the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. So that announced investigation commenced in May of 2015, concluded August 10th of 2016, where there were findings that the Baltimore Police Department had a pattern and practice that was found to be in violation of not only the Constitution, but other federal anti-discrimination statutes. So with that in mind, our city in 2017 entered into a federal consent decree to really undo the damage of past leaders and past folks that have been entrusted by the public to keep them safe. And we have at this moment new leadership that has also navigated a consent decree before in another part of the country. And I think we also have a national conversation and national momentum around what it means to have a police force that is highly functional, professional, keeps us safe while also upholding constitutional obligations. So we felt that this was as good a time as any to give Baltimoreans, but Marylanders overall, kind of an understanding of what this can mean for better policing, not only in Baltimore, but perhaps Maryland and the entire country, because the eyes of the nation are on Baltimore as we continue to navigate and comply with the federal consent decree. And we want to make sure that we learn from the lessons of other consent decrees, some that have had varying degrees of success and challenge, and that we make sure that we apply kind of those lessons to the moment we find ourselves in. So I feel incredibly honored to have the panel that we have today joining us, because these are people on the front lines of making this consent decree work, and they are incredibly busy people. And the fact that they're going to share an hour of their time with all of us today, I'm deeply appreciative. So at this time, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Delegate Erek Barron, Chair of the Prince George's County House Delegation to the Maryland General Assembly.
Thank you, Chair Smith. Again, I'm Eric Barron. I am delegate representing Legislative District 24 in Central Prince George's. I also chair the House of Delegates, Prince George's County House of Delegates Delegation to Annapolis. And I just want to thank you, Chair Smith, for your leadership in organizing this and allowing us to partner with you on a important topic generally, not just to our jurisdictions, but really to the whole state and part of a nationwide conversation. Really, it's just a great opportunity to further educate our colleagues and the broader public about policing and reform and the various types of reform, including federal consent decrees, which probably are the most high profile tool for policing reform, yet many of us probably don't know very much about what exactly it is and what that means. And in Prince George's, many probably don't even recall or know that Prince George's was entered into a consent decree with the Department of Justice back in 2004. So what are consent decrees and how do they stack up, along the spectrum of all the kind of tools and mechanisms that we've been discussing, whether it be legislation, local commissions and task forces. Where does a consent decree fall along those different tools along that spectrum? One would think they have a lot of credibility. They come with the backing of the U.S. Department of Justice. You have the courts involved. To some degree, it's less political. But how effective are they? And if you have a consent decree, do you need anything else? We have a task force, policing task force in the House of Delegates ongoing. We've had a report from State Senator Jill Carter on policing. We're going to have Senate hearings. So how do those things fit in with an ongoing federal consent decree development in Baltimore City? And to what extent has the prior consent decree in Prince George's meant anything? Some might argue that it hasn't meant much. We're in the midst of a transition ourselves in our police department. Our county executive has recently stood up a policing task force. So we have a lot going on, but how do they fit together and what do they mean? And hopefully we can find out some of that this evening with our panelists. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I want to introduce another one of my esteemed colleagues. She serves as second vice chair of the Baltimore City Delegation to the House of Delegates, and also specifically as the subcommittee chair for our Public Safety Committee. So could you please share some words with us today, Delegate Melissa Wells?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Delegate Melissa Wells, and I represent the 40th District, which includes the heart of West Baltimore and the community in which Freddie Gray came from. And so this conversation is near and dear to everyone in Maryland, but especially to a lot of the constituents that I represent. I echo all of the, I think, background and I think the emphasis about why this conversation is so important and timeliness that Delegation Chairs Barron and Smith shared. And I would just add that one other component of this that we have to really think about is the fact that a lot of the challenges that we see around police accountability and around biased interactions with the police have happen around with Black and Brown bodies. And so I think for Baltimore City Delegation, for Prince George's County Delegation to be really the delegations would have the largest Black population, this is something that is really near and dear and impacts our constituents. So we're really excited to have this dynamic panel that we have, the expertise that they really bring to the table to this conversation, and really charging a conversation about what we can do to actually increase accountability, increase civilian oversight and review, increase civilian in our communities' trust in the law enforcement that is there to uphold and protect and serve them. So thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you so much, Delegate Wells. At this time, I think it's just perfect to allow our lean panel to kind of introduce themselves. I will begin with our Police Commissioner, Michael Harrison. This is an opportunity for you to share a bit about you and your experience with consent decrees and how you're taking some of that experience and applying it to the moment you're in as our leader here in Baltimore City.
Well, first of all, thank you, Delegate Smith, and thank you to all of you. I'm happy to be a part of this panel with this esteemed panelists, and a couple of whom work with me every day in Baltimore. You'll get to meet them in just a minute. I spent 28 years in the New Orleans Police Department, 4.5 years as the police superintendent, and I was asked to take the lead of the department in the second year of their consent decree, which at the time was the most expansive and comprehensive in the entire United States in the history of consent decrees, only to be surpassed by Baltimore in recent times. And so New Orleans in 2012, when the Department of Justice did its investigation, called New Orleans the most troubled department in America. And that's a direct quote that made it into the scathing report that led us into that consent decree. And so when I went into that consent decree, like I said, it was in year 2. My predecessor had been saying, we're not that bad, they're overly hard, and it was a lot of resistance, although he too grew up in that department. I grew up in that department, so when I took over, I embraced it. And I said, hell yeah, we were that bad. And yes, our department did everything it was accused of doing. And yes, the way they described the culture was accurate. And so I think we begin to buy some level of credibility, and we begin to grow by first owning that we weren't as good as we thought we were. Maybe we weren't as bad as they accused us of, but yes, we were bad enough to make it into a consent decree. And so I was not the assistant chief when I became the chief of New Orleans. I was a district commander in charge of the largest district, the most populated district, the district with the most crime. But nevertheless, I had some experience implementing at the ground level as a commander the first year of the consent decree. But then when I took over as the chief, I was responsible for the entire implementation of all, 492 paragraphs, which was much larger. And if you think about that, even going back to the days of Rodney King in Los Angeles, in the Los Angeles consent decree, it was about half of what the New Orleans consent decree was. So not all consent decrees are equal. Prince George's would have been different than New Orleans, which is different from Baltimore. New Orleans was 100% makeover of a police department. Baltimore is 100% makeover. It's not just use of force and policies and training. It is 100% makeover. And so the New Orleans Police Department gave us then a good blueprint of what reimagining a police department would look like. If the community could design its department, what would it look like? And it was a blueprint. Now, that one is a little different from this one in Baltimore, but the people of Baltimore asked for it, the mayor asked for it, the Department of Justice gave us a description of what it was like with, of course, you called it patterns and practices of unconstitutional policing, and the total reimagining of what the people of Baltimore think its police department should look like. So people are talking about that now around the country, but we actually just decided that 3 years ago, and it made it into its consent decree because it is with community support and input that it was designed, and it too is a total makeover. And so my experience with New Orleans was about changing culture. Now, I came from within that department and was tasked with changing the culture. The policy creation was easy. You'll hear about that from Deputy Commissioner Murphy, but the culture change and shifting the way we thought and shifting the way we thought about our community members and how we wanted them to think about us was the hard part. But it was about, number one, finding leaders to be on the team, to be in leadership positions who bought in to the real need for change and the real desire for change. All of us knew we needed to change. All of us did not want to change. That's a big difference. And so I had to find people who had both will and capacity to execute change in an organization that did not want to change. And so we find the same thing here. Fast forward, you asked about my experience coming to Baltimore, the experience of leading an organization, whether I'm from inside or outside, of changing the culture and getting leaders who can compel their subordinates to think differently and to perform differently and to think not just differently about us, but how we think about our community members and how we want them to think about us and how we create policies and then perform to those policies so that we don't make them think about us a certain way, but our actions kind of lend them to think about us a certain way. And so I know we have a lot of questions, but I'll kind of stop here and let you go on for the other introductions.
Thank you so much for that. This is the perfect time for me. You just spoke him up, your Deputy Commissioner, Danny Murphy, to kind of talk about what your day-to-day role is in implementing, each phase of the consent decree we find ourselves in. So with no further ado, great to hear from you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thanks, Delegate Smith, Barron, and Wells for this opportunity to speak with everyone about this critical topic for the future of our community. So my name is Danny Murphy. As was said earlier, I'm the Deputy Commissioner over the Compliance Bureau for the Baltimore Police Department. In this role, I oversee the implementation of the consent decree, policy, training, technology, equity, and audits and inspections. So really, from beginning to end, implementing these massive reform mandates in practice. Prior to being in this role in Baltimore, I worked with Commissioner Michael Harrison in New Orleans, where for 5 years I worked overseeing the implementation of that consent decree in the last 2.5 years as the deputy superintendent over the whole effort, similar to the effort here in Baltimore. And what we have with these consent decrees is a federal mandate to implement so many of the reforms that communities across this nation are calling for today. And there are real benefits in having that consent decree because too often the police reform conversation kind of trails off after policy and training. It's all about performance and accountability and delivering the policing services that our communities need and deserve. And so in implementing these consent decrees, we start off with the policy, we look at the best practices, we have opportunities for public input, we have the DOJ and the monitors helping us make sure that we create the best policies we possibly can. Through that process, for example, we've created a use of force policy that other departments are now looking to mirror and to implement. Baltimore Police Department has a model policy on use of force right now, but the policy is just the beginning. Then we move on to training. We need to give our officers the guidance and the instruction that they need to carry out those practices on a regular basis to keep everyone in our community safe and deliver the best services we can to the community. So we put our whole department, retrained them in use of force practices to give them that guidance. And now it's in the implementation phase for use of force. And there's continual reporting and monitoring and accountability to ensure that those model policies and training we're carrying out every day on the streets and taking corrective action as necessary to ensure that we are being the police department we can be for this community. And that's just one of the many areas of our consent decree. Use of force is a core topic in reform today, but we're taking that very same process that has community input and transparent development and accountability at the end of the day to ensure we're delivering the services we need to our community in a variety of ways. Use of force, stop, search, and arrest, fair, impartial policing, community policing, and many other topics. So these consent decrees are really a blueprint to transform policing in the way that communities are calling for across the nation. And it's really, it's not the ceiling for policing. It's the new floor that we have to have as the Baltimore Police Department. And there's so much more we can do after that in this reimagining to ensure we have the best police department for our community. So it's really an honor to be here with all of you today and get to talk through this critical topic for building a better Baltimore and building better communities across the country.
Delegate, if I could jump in just for a second.
Of course.
You heard me say it, you heard Deputy Commissioner Murphy say it, it's a blueprint. and it's the floor, not the ceiling, but it's a blueprint with teeth. And the reason why I say it has teeth is because you have the Department of Justice and you have a federal judge overseeing it, meaning that there are guidelines and mandates. And if a city and a department does not comply within the timeline and make the reforms as agreed to and promised, then the teeth allows the judge to hold probably and most likely the police chief and the mayor and city in contempt. And there are stiff penalties to include prison if we don't comply. So it has teeth, and that is the key to drive compliance and implementation.
That's a great point, Commissioner. And people sometimes ask, well, how long does the consent decree last? Or how does it end? Well, it lasts as long as it needs to last until the Baltimore Police Department is delivering the policing services that are required. And how do we do that? We have to prove that we are delivering on all 511 paragraphs of the consent decree, and that we're delivering the outcomes that are called for in the consent decree of improved public trust, decreases in use of force, and all kinds of other metrics that our communities are calling for. There's a real sustainability question that Delegate Barron was talking about, of ensuring that these things can keep going after the consent decree. And in New Orleans, we put in a city ordinance basically to ensure the sustainability after the consent decree concluded, and we were delivering those outcomes to ensure it continues to move forward, because there's so much work we put into building the police department the community deserves. We need to keep it going when it finally concludes.
Thank you for that. And we're gonna be talking more, so I don't want you to think that's the only time you both got to speak. I want to give an opportunity for Professor Wendell France, a professor of criminal justice at Coppin State, to discuss the nature of his work as it pertains to the public and their relationship to consent decrees and their success and challenges. We're really happy to have you with us today, Professor.
Well, thanks for inviting me. And first, let me applaud you three delegates for just taking the time to delve into this unique area of policing, dealing with oversight, accountability, and the need for consent decrees. By way of introduction, I am a retired member of the Baltimore Police Department. I spent 27 years there. I retired as a district commander. I went on to do some work for the Justice Department around the time that we began doing pattern and practice investigations. The first agency I worked with through the Justice Department was the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C., and then some subsequent 12 or 13 agencies over the next 13 years, dealing with not just the findings, the process in which the DOJ investigation goes through, but then working with agencies to not only identify whether they had the capacity to meet the mandates that are set forth in the consent decree, and when they don't have the capacity, how to help the specific police department to build the capacity to have people that can see the direction that the Justice Department intends for the agency to go with the oversight support of the monitoring team and the federal judge. I did that work for quite a while, ultimately coming back into public service, working for the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services here in Maryland. Retired in 2015 as the Deputy Secretary for Operations, but I remained involved in policing practices and teaching policing and criminal justice courses at Coppin State University and at Bowie State University. I went to Coppin in 2008 and Bowie some years later, working with criminal justice students in this venue. I also served for a time as the agency director for the Citizens Complaint Authority in Cincinnati, Ohio, which was at that time the agency responsible for investigating allegations of misconduct by members of the Cincinnati Police Department. And so I've worked from the law enforcement side, I worked from the civilian oversight side, trying to bring about some of the reforms. So between the DOJ investigations that I've done and working with a few monitoring teams over the years and the academic background of what this environment looks like, I land where I am today. So I'm probably, I don't want Commissioner Harris to take off this, but I'm probably the oldest person on the panel. because I started my career in 1970. And so we've seen a huge evolution in policing over the years. And the police department I joined in 1970 was not the police department I retired from, nor is it the police department that Commissioner Harrison leads today. And part of that is what we have gone through as a society around police practices, citizen interaction, oversight, accountability, and actually what do we want the police to do? And how do we design a system in which they can do it? And so I stand back to answer questions and talk a bit more about the questions that you're going to pose to me. But again, I appreciate being invited to this.
Thank you for that. And you're telling on yourself. I wouldn't have known your seasoning, Professor France, if you didn't share that with us. We wouldn't have been aware of that. But at any rate, I want to turn it back to our police commissioner, because I know that there are on-ramps for the public to be engaged in this process that are formal, within the consent decree. But what are some other pathways to engaging the public that maybe they are not availing themselves of, or you wish they would avail themselves of more regularly to deepen the relationship and to make sure we're hearing on the front lines what communities need?
Well, thank you for that. The thing that's very different about the Baltimore Police Department that impresses me that we did not have in New Orleans is all of our policies. I mean, every policy is put out for community input before it is approved. Now, we had community input, but not like it is here. We had community representation and help design, but the entire community can see the design of a policy and give input for 30 days, and then we send it out for a second round for another 30 days. That's number one. But I think the thing that we're missing, especially during this COVID epidemic, is the ability to be face-to-face with members of our community to hear directly from the community. As you remember, I hit the ground running first, meeting with and hearing from the community, and I did it again at the end of the year across the entire city, even with more intensity than we did when we started. And so Deputy Commissioner Murphy often has consent decree community meetings where we give updates to the community about the consent decree. What we find is that very few people show up to that, and we need to do a better job announcing and advertising it, but we need to do a better job getting people involved to come and know what the police department is doing, how we're reforming, how we're transforming, and how we're becoming the department they're asking us to be. And I think the missing element is how we get that information out and inspire and motivate people to come out and really learn about their police department, but then push the police department to be better so that they can hold us accountable. Certainly with COVID, we missed those meetings. We're doing much of what we do now virtually, but there are things built into the consent decree to ensure that. And that's not just something we want to do, we're actually mandated to do that. And we do that pretty regularly. I think we have to find a way to get back to that. And at some point, I think Murphy will come back and touch that a little bit also.
Feel free to jump in, Commissioner Murphy.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as the commissioner said, sometimes we have to do these 18 meetings, and it's a great opportunity for us to get the word out there and engage with the public about the reforms. And there were these separate meetings, and sometimes the attendance wasn't what we wanted it to be. So we changed the dynamic from asking people to come to us and starting to go to them. And so we've engaged various neighborhood groups in the different districts and are starting to present as part of their meetings to increase those engagement opportunities. But yeah, as the commissioner said, we've got formal opportunities for people to engage on any of our policies and any of our training development that's up on our website right now. And we also have a community training review committee where we provide distilled versions of our training to make sure it's aligning with their vision of what our training should look like. And we're making a big advancement right now. We've got a framework for it with our new community policing plan. And that's something that the DOJ criticized with the BPD in their investigation. And we recently created our first ever plan. It's creating a framework for greater engagement across the department, not just a specialized unit, but really creating a department-wide approach to trying to increase engagement, improve police community relations, and really work together with the community on solving the problems that are in front of us.
One more thing before we move on, and I heard Delegate Wells say this, and she said it very eloquently. The communities that are most impacted are Black and brown communities, and by police inaction or negative police action. And when it comes to a consent decree, we saw this in New Orleans, and most cities see this, especially cities that deal with violent crime, like New Orleans and especially Baltimore, that it's the unconstitutional practices of and patterns and behaviors of unconstitutional police practices that led us into a consent decree. But when the days and weeks shift to a focus on violent crime, sometimes the very communities that ask for constitutional practices are then asking for relief from the violent crime, and then will sometimes not even realize that they're saying things like, well, the consent decree is causing officers to not be able to do their jobs, because you hear officers say that, and then residents will repeat that because they hear officers say that, which in early years of consent decree, you hear officers say that. Now we're in year 3. I'm beginning to hear that a lot less. I don't hear it as much as I heard a year and a half ago, because officers have seen us and we have now demonstrated that we can reduce crime and be constitutional at the same time. And I think we have to continue to tell that story to our own members and show them their own success so that we can stop making excuses about that. But we have to also do a good job in the community talking about how we are going to reduce crime, prevent crime, deter it, displace it, apprehend people who commit crime and hold them accountable, while at the same time change the department into a department of accountability and transparency and high performance. But when we get spikes in crime and people are negatively affected and our heart goes out to them, we can't let the narrative change back to, well, it's the consent decree that's causing the officers to not perform, thus we have spikes in crime. We managed it in New Orleans, and I think we're beginning to see a crossover where we're seeing it less and less, but we have to make sure the narrative stays correctly with the community, because they only repeat what they hear the officers say.
Chairman Barron, would you like to offer any questions at this time?
Sure, thank you. Well, one, I want to say I really appreciate the commissioner's emphasis that we can have constitutional policing and reduce crime at the same time. I think that bears repeating as much as possible. I want to get back to the sustainability question again, because we might have great representatives at the state level, the city level, county level, and great police chiefs now, and they might be doing the right thing now, whatever we consider that to be. But how does what you're trying to do, and how does the consent decree live beyond the personalities who may be in charge now? I think the city has had a number of leadership changes. Prince George's County going through its own leadership change now. And I'll just put this out there. We here in Annapolis, well, it's the problem is a Baltimore City problem. Everywhere else, we're good, and maybe they are, or maybe they aren't. And pick a city or a jurisdiction in Maryland. But how much of that is driven by the strong leadership of the individual who may be at the head of the police department now, versus a month, few years from now, where you have different personalities that make for different practices at the community level. And
It's a little frozen, but I think you had a little bit to start with in terms of the sustainability question. So anyone who would like to jump in, feel free.
Yeah, I'll jump in right quick, and I know others have a lot to say. I see now what is happening, which was very similar to what we did in New Orleans. In New Orleans, as as I ended, my 4.5 years, we went to the city council and we codified much of what was in the consent decree by regulation and ordinance. I think there was one regulation, but the rest were ordinances of all of the things in the consent decree, so that when there is a different mayor, when there is a different police chief, the department has to have a unanimous council decision to remove body cameras, or there will always be a compliance and audit unit. There will always be all of the things that are mandated by the consent decree, or as many as possible, codified in ordinances that have to remain. And it has to be, I believe, Danny, a unanimous city council vote to remove any of it. But I think the citizens of the city would never allow that, because we moved the culture in such a different direction. Not only the culture within the department, but the culture in the community, where there is an expectation of excellence within the department now. And yeah, they'll make mistakes from time to time, but we changed the culture in the department, but we changed the culture and expectations of the community members to expect a department of high performance and accountability. That's what we're doing here. And I see the state delegation, the working groups on reform, city council meetings on oversight and reform. I see all of that taking shape. And at some point, we have to have a discussion either at the state or at the local or both levels on what we want to build into some kind of local or state legislation on what the Baltimore Police Department's design should be like, and how it should perform beyond the life of the consent decree, and what does oversight look like beyond the consent decree. And yeah, we have a lot of oversight. We have community members, we have the consent decree monitors, but the consent decree will go away. And it is my job, and it is with Murphy and me and the help of Michelle and all the great people who work on our team, and all of you as our elected leaders, to turn the department into the type of the department that can come in compliance with the consent decree. So at some point in the near future, it will go away, but there needs to be some level of oversight to ensure that the department doesn't backslide into its old patterns and practices. And I think that's the $64,000 question. But we have to change the culture. I am in the process now, with the help of my team, working to transform the leadership and building the leaders of the future. So even when I move on and I find myself in a rocking chair, the next generation of leaders will be forward-leaning, forward-thinking, progressive, accountability-minded leaders for any mayor to select from, and the citizens can feel confident that the city won't backslide.
And Delegate Barron, that's an important piece to the commissioner says about codifying and ensuring that we codify in ordinance and statute what the consent decree has. But it's equally as important that the person that you hire to run that police department, no matter what department it is, has the capacity to understand what's required and the will to move it forward. So you can have it codified and you end up having someone take over your agency who doesn't have the capacity or doesn't understand what is involved in sustaining that progress. And so it's good to have it all in place, documented, codified, but if you bring in people who don't understand the importance, the necessity, or the capacity to enforce and create those new environments, then you're going to be fighting to keep that sustainability moving.
Delegate Wells, I wanted to give you an opportunity to pose some questions to our panel as well.
Thank you. No, this is such a rich discussion, and really, I think kind of continuing to lead with this conversation around accountability, because I think that all parties have to be accountable to each other. But Professor France, I'm just curious to hear more about your thoughts, especially when we look towards sustainability, but specifically the fact that this is a partnership with the community and with our civilians. And so I would love to understand if you could really share with us what are some of the challenges with really making the civilian review board or civilian review that style of governance, how can we make sure that the recommendations of the consent decree, that the Civilian Review Board can continue to keep that uplifted and help us accomplish those goals in a
Well, there are
meaningful
a couple
way?
of things. Yes, a couple of things you have to look at. From the consent decree perspective, it is generally believed that the monitoring team, and the court will advocate on behalf of the community, and that the police department gets feedback from the community about the direction that the consent decree or the compliance. What we're talking now is the compliance to the findings that come out of the consent decree are addressed. So the monitoring team and the court now ensure that what we say the department needs to do, they're in fact doing it. We get confused sometimes when we talk about civilian oversight. Civilian oversight is not simply having some agency or some part of the police department or some external standalone organization look at police complaints. It's far more than that. It has a great deal to do with how we train our citizens to interact with the police and how we train the police to interact with the citizens. It's about how accessible is our complaint process. It's about how amenable are we to relooking at policies when we determine that there may be a policy flaw that causes officers to do something that was unintended when we enacted that policy. And so there has to be a great deal of discussion and interaction between the community and the stakeholders and the agency, the federal court, and the monitoring team, so that all of those voices are heard. Quite frankly, in most cases, and the commissioner said this, the community really doesn't know what this is all about. There's a lot of effort being expended to create the best police department that you could have in the country, and citizens who ask for this don't really know how that comes about. And it comes about with good leadership. It comes about with good policies. It comes about with a transparent internal disciplinary process. People who don't belong in police departments need to be removed, and they need to be removed swiftly, not over some protracted period of time. And so all those things go into what happens, what hits the commissioner's desk. What hits his desk is a reflection of how well he's adjusting and moving to those different components that created this consent order that he's under.
If I could ask a kind of a follow-up question, but I think Professor French, you made a point around kind of the including it in the training and kind of comprehensively applying community involvement. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the Policing Inside Out course that I believe is done with Coppin State, I think Howard. I think it would be good. And I think it would be good for folks to hear that, obviously training is a big part of it, but that we also have our historically Black institutions leading this charge, also located in the communities where some of this community engagement and interaction is really needed the most. And so I'm hoping you could kind of share a little bit more. And if others have anything to add to that as well, I welcome them to speak on it.
Yes. So let's take a look at how we got here from a police perspective. Historically, when I became a police officer because there was an expectation in the community that if we had more African American police officers, then they would get a different kind of treatment than what they would be getting from non-African Americans. And so in the 60s and 70s, the hue and cry was to get more Black leadership in the police departments, and then that would help solve some of the problems that the community experienced. So policing inside and out is simply taking the police department, the police personnel, and exposing them to the different nuances that they may experience in a community and trying to develop sensitivities around those kind of issues. But there goes another dynamic. Most of police officers in Baltimore City don't live in Baltimore City. And so there has to be a relationship with the community before there can be any respect or any other kind of interaction with the citizens. No relationship comes from there being the agency employees being estranged from the very people they deal with every day. So when they come to work, oftentimes they take the posture of an occupying force as opposed to public servants, public safety employees. And so we can't create a program to deal with that. That's part of that culture change the commission is struggling with. How do we get that culture to see people, law-abiding citizens, right, as citizens, and come to not make the assumption that because I'm in a certain neighborhood or I have a certain look that I'm part of a problem that really may not exist. Conversely, we got to go back to the community and have them identify what are the issues that they are impacted with in their communities and what can they do? What can they do to resolve those issues absent bringing in the police? Because when you bring in the police, you have to realize he or she only has so many tools in his toolkit. But community-based problems are best solved in the community. So we have to now build that capacity in our community. So the police department is charged with doing a great deal of things simultaneously to maintaining safety and order in the community. And the community needs to take and shift that paradigm where they're dealing more effectively with community-based problems and resolving some of the internal conflicts that they may exceed, that then lessens the need to have police officers involved in that. So the culture change, the education of the community, the transparency of what's happening, they all come together sort of a united synergy around healthy environments and functional policing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So I do have a question from Facebook, and this is really revolved around the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, which I know many are familiar with. But a lot of emphasis, a lot of conversation around whether, when we talk about transparency, we talk about accountability. To what extent does the LEOBOR impede or make accomplishing those goals more of a challenge? So I would love to hear from the commissioner about thoughts on that.
Yeah, the LEOBR certainly inhibits our ability for total transformation and real reform. There's some reform we can do, but when you want to get to real reform, it certainly has some issues with it that prohibits me from taking the necessary actions that have to be taken. I totally believe in due process. But I absolutely believe that as an executive, like any executive in any major organization, I should have the autonomy and authority to remove members from service when they do not belong in this agency. Now, I have to have compelling reasons to make me do that, but when they exist, I should have that. And then we have to be absolutely transparent with our community, and that's the Public Information Act. And I need to be able to override decisions and be the executive that the people expect me to be. They hired me to come in to be the executive. They hold me accountable, but then I'm limited in some of the decisions I can make because there are laws that prohibit me from doing the things that people would actually expect me to do. So I am advocating for changes to it, not to abolish it, or for changes to it that allow me to be the executive that people hire me to be. And we need to change a number of things so that we can be transparent, because there are a number of things that people need to be able to know about members of their police department. Perhaps not everything, but there's some things that people absolutely need to know that really do not affect the officer's performance or take anything away from the officer's ability to do his or her job.
Thank you. Professor France, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this.
Well, I lived, I was there before LEOBR, and I lived through it. There are a couple nuances that came about in the subsequent years, particularly the number of officers who are represented by the same bargaining agent. And when you have scheduled hearings or you want to do interviews, you may be limited because of the availability of the attorneys. There are a lot of things that ended up being in the labor agreement that impact the agency's executives from doing some things that they need to do. So all those things have to be addressed. But LEOBR, I believe we saw it come on board in 1974. It has probably lived its life's existence because the conditions that we were dealing with in 1974 are not the same conditions that we're dealing with today. We came off of a police strike where large numbers of people were affected by the fact that they went on strike. And so what did we end up with? A piece of legislation that was supposed to inure police officers a certain number of rights. And I don't know if those are the same conditions that we are dealing with today. And so it may be time to revisit LEOBR. I know some of my law enforcement colleagues don't like to hear me say that, but it really may be time to revisit LEOBR. There was a time when the chief of police, the police commissioner, was the final arbiter on discipline, did not have to negotiate with anybody else. If the trial board came back with a finding, the commissioner had some options that he or she could undertake and take action. And that's what I mean about a transparent internal disciplinary process where people get brought when officers are involved in allegations of misconduct or rules violations, that there's a swift process in which to get those cases adjudicated and move on. And maybe something as simple as retraining an officer could resolve an issue, but we don't get to do that because these investigations become so protracted and drawn out over the years that it's really, at the end of the day, they really have no purpose in even trying to adjudicate the cases.
No, thank you for, like you said, that life before and after, or during, I should say. But we have another question, and it is really revolving around a comprehensive uniform code of police conduct, asking if we can, if that's something that the state should be looking at, and if not, why can't the state implement something to that nature?
Great question. And what you have is from state to state, each state certifies its police officers to be officers in that state. And some of the certifications are different from state to state. But each state has its own governing body to create certifications based on its training certifications, and it has its own training boards. I'm part of a group, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, that just did a body of work and produced a report. I think we sent that to you, to the delegates. If not, we'll get it to you. That talks about recommendations nationwide for chiefs and mayors to think about how their police departments should be run, how their police departments should be disciplined, and how their police department should be trained, and all of those type of things. Certainly, there should be some standardization across state lines, across the country, so we all can be held to the same standard. But with 18,000 police departments in America, the majority of which have 25 officers or less, it makes it very, very difficult. But certainly, those are recommendations that we're working on. But across our state, certainly, we want to make sure that there's certain standardization that all of us live up to. And then when people don't live up to it, they can't leave one department and then go to another department, and then we're just moving a problem from one agency to the next.
Thank you so much. I think we're about winding down on time. I want to be respectful. We have about 4 minutes left, but I just wanted to unpack for the commissioner and the panel that question was posed by a former member of our armed services, who said, when you're a member of the armed services, there is a universal code of conduct under which, you kind of know the standard. There is a standard that is fairly uniform. And I think particularly because Annapolis is the home of our Navy, right, of our Naval Academy, he was pointing out there's an opportunity to even learn from them about what constitutes certain types of universal expectations for, performance that maybe could be woven, into broader conversation. So I just wanted to give a little context for that question as it was posed. Chair Barron, I want to give you a chance to give some closing thoughts, or even pose a last question before we wind down here, sir.
I would just say I appreciate the commissioner and our panelists and their thoughts on sustainability and oversight in particular, and specifically naming the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights and the Public Information Act, which our public access laws shield personnel records of law enforcement officers. So you really can't understand, someone's misconduct history, if they have any, and understand how the department has addressed instances of misconduct. And the fact that you all seem to have committed to not just going through the consent decree, not just implementing this consent decree, but taking the step at the local and state level to offer your advocacy and your recommendations for change at the state level, and statewide. I think that's going to be very important going forward. I know that both sides of the General Assembly and both sides of the aisle are going to be relying on your input in that respect. So I hope that we can rely on you, come January, which sometimes seems like a long time from now, and we wonder if the energy that we see now is going to be there in January, February, March, April. That's when we're going to need each of the panelists there and advocating for the right changes that need to be made. So thank you.
Delegate Wells.
Thank you. I just wanted to echo my gratitude, and honestly, I think the amazing transparency, and also I think the commitment I sense in all of the panelists in terms of where we can go and that we can get there. I think it was Deputy Commissioner Murphy that said that we can do constitutional policing and still reduce crime. And I feel like those are some very succinct but very deep and impactful words that we can all keep in our pockets. So thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you. And I feel like there was a little bit of a charge the commissioner made, or maybe Deputy Commissioner maybe didn't realize they were making. But I think we all have a responsibility to amplify your efforts around community engagement. Quite frankly, some of you know in my day job, I do that for a city agency. And no one has ever accused government of being a flashy marketing machine by any stretch of the imagination. That's just not, that does not tend to be a strength. There's so many great programs people don't know about. There's just so many things that sometimes go underutilized or under interacted with, simply because people don't know about the opportunity, or they know too late, about the opportunity. So I want to make sure that you have a partner in the delegation and kind of continuing to get the word out about these opportunities and our members. And I feel just in general, that's something that I want to be a better thought partner around, getting in front as much lead time and helping to get people, participating more, because sometimes people don't know they have a chance to weigh in. And when they find out, it's really can be an empowering thing. So I want to say thank you to Commissioner Harrison. I know every day is long, and you still, carved out some time for us and the delegation. We're very appreciative. Deputy Commissioner Murphy, again, very thankful for the work that you're doing. It is not easy. It looks like it may not end, but it's very, very, very important. And then to our what did you say? Our most seasoned veteran member of the panel, Professor Franz. I mean, he was like, "Oh, I was working before the LEOBR. I was already." I was like, "I remember you passed that." So you're like, "Hey, I was able to, do my job before it." So I just thank you for giving us even kind of that wisdom of your different experiences as an officer, as a consultant, as a person working with community, and as someone shaping the future. As a professor, just thank you for sharing your perspective. And what we'll do is also share some of the links to how people can get more involved with the monitoring of the consent decree. We'll just make sure people know where that is. And if there's anything in particular, Professor, that you want us to lift up from your work in terms of any websites or emails, please share that with us offline, and we'll make sure to push that out too. We want to lift up your work scholarship as well.
Will do.
Thank you so much. I think we're right on time. Oh, 2 minutes over. I'm sorry. I do thank you for your time, and I do hope you have a great evening and rest of your week.
Thank you all. We enjoyed being here.
Thank you.